Good morning in California and good evening to friends in Poland. My name is Rabbi Chaim Dov Belyak. Uh, I'm pleased, as the Executive Director of Friends of Jewish Renewal, to welcome you to the first of a multi-part class celebrating the translation into Polish of a book by Rabbi Marc Rosenstein, who will introduce in just a moment. The class today uh, has three of its Polish rabbi teachers, um, and I'll introduce them now. Rabbi Monty Kirschenbaum, who's in Fullerton, California at Beth Tikva. uh, Rabbi Miriam Klimova, who is in Haifa, um, and with her congregation in Israel. And I also want to introduce unknown caller. Um, I also want to introduce the uh, uh, person who is running the technical activities, Dominika Zakachewska, and I would ask everyone to turn to the globe at the bottom of their screen. Uh, there's a globe, and you should choose the language that you're most comfortable with. Since the class is going to be offered in Polish, we're going to move uh, to hearing the translation that will be uh, delivered to us by Marek Yazowski and Marzena Szymanska to the language that is the opposite of the one that's being spoken. Rabbi Monty will be conducting the class today. Uh, Let me also introduce two of the people who've had a hand in reading and preparing the translation. Um, Professor Mirosław Patalon, Arek, um, and Professor Jan Frankowski, who are here with us today. They will be participating in the final editing of the book, which has been translated. So at this moment, what I'd like to do is, first of all, greet um, Rabbi Rosenstein and thank him for the book and just ask him to say a few words of introduction about the book and what his aspirations were in creating the book.
Thank you, Chaim. This is actually a very exciting moment for me. I never imagined when I wrote the book that someday I would be participating in a class in which the book is being taught in any other language than English, and certainly not Polish. So I really want to thank Rabbi Beliak and all the people involved in preparing the translation for their work and for their vision. And it's very sort of moving, and I'm very proud to be involved in contributing to in some way to Jewish renewal in Poland. And I'll just say, as a personal comment on the experience of writing the book, um, it was a very interesting challenge when the Jewish Publication Society said that we wanted to do a book on turning points in Jewish history, but it's for a one-year course, and a one-year course is generally 30 lessons. And so you have to come up with 30 turning points. And you could certainly make a case for there only being three. The Exodus, Mount Sinai, and the exile in 586 BCE, and all the rest is commentary. Or you could make a case for there being several hundred or 1,000 turning points at many different moments in Jewish history when things went different ways from the way they had gone before, either because of material factors or spiritual factors or a combination of them all. And so the idea of trying to summarize all of Jewish history in 30 points, which somehow can be justified as turning points, it was a very interesting challenge. And I think I would like to see it, and I think I mentioned this in the book, as a challenge for the students to see whether they agree, and whether the turning points are convincing as turning points, as significant turning points. or whether some of them are superfluous and some are missing. And that leaves us, of course, with a difficult question of what do we do with the period in which we're living right now? How does one recognize a turning point when one might be going through it? And when we look back on today, 50 or 100 years from now, for example, will the war that Israel is presently experiencing, let's say, or the outbreaks of anti-Semitism around the world that the Jewish people is experiencing, be turning points? Will Jewish history be different from this day forth? Or will they be blips? Minor wiggles in the graph of Jewish history, which will move forward in patterns that had already been set by other turning points. I mean, the whole question of defining turning points is a fascinating one, and I found it so, and I hope that studying the book will help other people have the same experience of thinking about the meaning of the events that we look back on and call history. And when I tuned into the introductory session, now one last point. I heard Professor Kirschenbaum mention the whole question of why the book begins with ahistorical things, points. And that's a really good question. And another question that the entire project of the book raises is where is the line between collective memory and academic history? Issue which has troubled Jewish thinkers and historians for the past couple hundred years, and is a very interesting question, which the book sort of answers in passing, but doesn't really address in a serious philosophical way. There's another challenge for the teachers of the book and for readers of it in contemplating that divide between collective memory, which may or may not correspond to what the textual and archaeological record will show about the events that we remember as what we call today history. So again, it's very exciting for me to be here and to be part of this project, and I wish everybody who's involved in it a success and that people will enjoy and learn from the course and from the translation.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. In a moment, I'm going to be turning the class over to Rabbi Moti Kirschenbaum, who received the promotion to professor this morning. We're very appreciative of your.
You don't have to pay me for it. It was free. It's okay. I mean, I'm glad to give out the titles to anybody who likes them.
Thank you. I'm just sharing for everyone's information just before we uh, turn to the lecture and to welcoming Rabbi Kirschenbaum's leadership. The fact that this project was conceived as something that Professor Pavel Spivak would be involved with. Unfortunately, he passed almost at the beginning of this project, and I want to acknowledge that his work at JICH, the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, was so central to the preserving the memory of the Ringelblum archive in various languages. And so I've just placed his picture before you. And just finally to add one other thing, and that is that in addition to Rabbi Kirschenbaum, Rabbi Klimova, and Menachem Mirsky, there will be from time to time opportunities for people to come together to talk. We want to welcome the students of the class. And as we move to the Polish, I just want to acknowledge one other happy duty, and that is that this translation was done by Dorota Gobolewska, and we're still working on the copy editing. And I want to acknowledge a special grant that made this project possible by Ellen Grant, who happens to be a classmate of mine from my undergraduate days at Occidental College, in memory of her grandmother, Ellen Friedman Gluck, and her mother, Estelle Gluck Grant. So with those acknowledgments, I want to invite uh, Rabbi Kirschenbaum to take the floor and to introduce the topics. And I'm sure that he will involve many of you in different aspects in the conversations. Mati?
So I will start off like just like Andrzej Wajda, Polish director, started his Oscar acceptance speech. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I will now speak Polish." So now I officially switch to Polish. Moi drodzy, witajcie do naszego
So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our cycle of lectures based on the book Turning Points in Jewish History,
napisanej przez profesora Rosensteina,
The book was
właśnie
written by
powitaliśmy.
Rabbi Marc
Tak jak
Rosenstein, whom we've just welcomed
zostało
here.
zaprowadzone, to jest cykl 30
So it was introduced as a
wykładów,
cycle of
dlatego,
30
że
lectures,
uniwersytecki rok zazwyczaj ma 30
because usually
30
the
zajęć,
university year has
30
30
tygodni
classes,
wykładów.
30
W związku z tym
weeks of
oczywiście
lectures.
pojawiło się pytanie, jakie wydarzenia zostają
So, of course, the question
w tym
arises
cyklu i
which events
jakie
to
są
include in the
pominięte.
cycle
Tak jak
and
profesor
which ones
Rosenstein
to skip.
zauważył, można
So, as
można zadać
Professor
sobie pytanie,
Rosenstein mentioned,
ile
we
tych
could
wydarzeń
ask the
jest, które
question
zasługują na
how
to,
many
żeby
such
się
events
pojawić na tym
actually there
liście,
are,
a które
which
nie.
events deserve to
I też
be
oczywiście
part of the list and which
to
do
nie
not deserve
wymaga
it.
tego, w jakiej epoce my się znajdujemy.
So,
I
this
też
raises the
profesor
question of
Rosenstein
the era that
zadał
we
świetne
live
pytanie na
in.
temat
And
różnicy
Professor Rosenstein
między tym, co
asked
się
a great
wydarzyło
question
i tym, co
about the
zostało
difference
zapamiętane.
between
Czasem
what
mniejsze wydarzenia
already
albo wydarzenia,
happened
które
and what
nie są
has been
potwierdzone historycznie,
remembered.
potrafią
Sometimes some
mieć
small
tak
events that do
ogromne
not have
znaczenie w naszej
historical proof
pamięci
can be really significant
grupy
in our
etnicznej, czy grupy
memory, the
społecznej, czy
memory
też
of the
narodu,
ethnic
że
or
są prawdziwe,
societal
mimo
group
że
or a national
nie
memory,
są
that they
potwierdzone
become true
historycznie.
even
No i
though they
właśnie
have not been proven
takim
historically.
wydarzeniem, które sensu stricte nie jest potwierdzone
So such an event that
historycznie,
has not been strictly historically
wydarzeniem, którym
proven
się będziemy zajmować
is the
dzisiaj,
event
czyli
that we'll be
wezwanie
discussing today.
Abrahama, które
So
ciężko
the
jest
call to
umiejscowić
Abraham,
w czasie, natomiast
it's
tutaj
difficult to place
profesor
it in time
Rosenstein próbuje je
exactly,
umiejscowić
but Professor
w
Rosenstein
15
is
stuleci przed naszą
trying
erą, czyli mniej
to
więcej
say it
3,5
was
tysiąca
1500 years before
lat
the Common Era,
temu. I jest to
so around
wydarzenie,
3,000, 3,500 years
które
ago.
według profesora
So this is an
Rosensteina
event that,
rozpoczyna
according to
historię
Professor
narodu
Rosenstein,
żydowskiego, dlatego że
starts the history of the
jest
Jewish
to wydarzenie,
people,
które daje nam jako przedstawicielom narodu żydowskiego
because it's an event that gives us as representatives of the Jewish people a sense of continuity between the
bohaterów opisanych w tym
strivings and the
wydarzeniu,
challenges of
a nami.
the
Myślę, że
protagonists of those
myślę, że
events,
tu
and
warto
we can
powiedzieć, że
compare
profesor
it to
Rosenstein
our
zauważył,
own challenges and
że
struggles.
Abraham jest pierwszym
Professor
jest pierwszym
Rosenstein
Hebrajczykiem,
mentioned that
natomiast
Abraham was the first
natomiast
Hebrew man,
jest to Hebrajczyk w znaczeniu
but
kogoś, kto nie
he's a
należy do
Hebrew
poszczególnej
in
grupy
the
społecznej,
meaning
tylko
of someone who
kogoś,
does not
kto jest
belong
obcym
to a
outsiderem
special
albo immigrantem
societal group,
od
but
słowa
who is an
la'avot, czy
outsider, a
czyli
migrant
być,
from La'avot.
przejść z jednej
So
strony na drugą,
to
na drugą
pass, to cross from one side
stronę.
to the other.
Właśnie dlaczego to wydarzenie ma otwierać historię Żydów?
So
Dlatego,
why
że
should this
Abraham
event open the history of the
razem z
Jews?
jego rodziną, dokonując
Because
tego
Abraham,
wyboru
along with his family,
odseparowania się
as he made the choice to
reszty
separate himself from the rest
plemion
of
na
the
Bliskim
society
Wschodzie,
or the
zaczyna
tribe in the
nową
Middle East,
wartość
started
w historii świata
a
i
new value
wprowadza
in the history of the world.
do tej grupy etnicznej
So
elementy
he
świadomości, które
introduces
będą
into this ethnic group elements of awareness, of
żydowskie.
consciousness
No i
that will
właśnie,
be specifically
jak
Jewish.
to wydarzenie jest opisane, tu
And how is
rzeczywiście
this
Księga
event
Rodzaju,
described?
rozdział
Of course, we
12,
have the book
wersy
of Genesis,
pierwszy
chapter
i
12,
drugi. I
verses
rzekł
1 and
pójść do
2.
Abrahama, wyjdź z
So
ziemi
God
twojej, z
said to
ojczyzny
Abraham,
twojej i z
go
domu ojca
forth
twego
from
do
your
ziemi, którą ci
land, from your
wskażę, a
homeland, from the
uczynię
land
cię
of your
wielkim
father, to
i
the earth
błogosławię
that I will point to
cię.
you, and I will
Także
bless you
także
and
ten
make you
motyw
plentiful.
odseparowania się
So
od
this
od
idea
innych
of separation,
tu na pewno
of
jest
separating yourself from others,
uwypuklone.
Here, this is emphasized, as well as the promise that the small ethnic group will be made into a great nation. So Professor Rosenstein is also discussing the geopolitical context of that event, namely that Abraham was born in the city of Ur. It was one of the city-states in Mesopotamia. It was related with Tel el-Mukayar in the southern western place in today's Iraq. So Abraham's journey is the journey across the crescent that is rich in resources. And he's trying to reach the place that is located in that area, but it's actually in the border between the two centers of the local civilization.
Istotnym elementem, który tu jest poświęcony, to jest to, że to, co wyróżnia tą grupę ludzi, którzy z tego wezwania Abrahama przyjmują.
So what distinguishes the group of people who also accept this challenge of Abraham, who also set forth and go on this journey, these are people who believe in a different concept of time, because in the Middle East, there is an ahistorical understanding of time. So it's ahistorical and cyclical. So there is a repetition of subsequent cycles of nature. So you have the dry season, the season of rain.
Natomiast nie mają tutaj znaczenia
And here, individual events are not really significant. If something happens, then this individual event is inscribed into the drama of nature or in the history of contacts between gods that have been described in the mythology of the Middle East. So you have cyclical events. So this act of choosing Abraham is an strictly individual event. God says to Abraham, you go forth, you do something, and Abraham follows this event, and this opens up a different concept of time. Because from this point on, this specific group of people who will view themselves as descendants of Abraham will view this time as a constructive moment for them. So it's not a moment of a divine drama. It's not a moment when, again, we are collecting the harvest and so on, but it's a moment that made Abraham into who he is. And it also made people who identified themselves with Abraham's legacy into a nation who subscribes to their own choices, and they feel like they can choose their own historical moments. So from a religious perspective, and this is my own note when we talk about Lech Lecha, so go forth, live for yourself. This is a moment that makes Abram change into Abraham. So we view this as a moment that motivates us, contemporary Jews, to choose our own path. So we could say that it's an event that lives within us, that each of the descendants of Abraham have to choose their own path through this constitutional moment. So just like Abraham Haivri, we are people who leave one space and we move into another space. So we decide that we want to set our own path. And it's really significant what Professor Rosenstein emphasizes, and it's not been proven historically in any way. So we have the city of Ur, and it's described as the place where Abraham was born. It's an important civilizational settlement. But Abraham and Sarai have never actually been described as proven historical protagonists or figures. So here we can ask the question whether they are historical figures, and we've just not been able to prove that, or whether they are just literary figures who exemplify and express the experience of many generations that has been concentrated into one pair of protagonists. And here Professor Rosenstein asks a great question. Was it just an aha moment of just Abraham, or was it an experience spanning across several generations? Was it the result of a political fight for power when one group had to distinguish itself from the establishment? We cannot leave out these different interpretations. We can just say that at that time we had a new concept that emerged from the old one that was based on one Almighty God, and the understanding that history is the record of the interactions of that God with the world. So the history of Abraham is an attempt to describe that history in a realistic way. So maybe a short, concentrated literary way of describing a new tendency, a new way of perceiving the world that appeared among a specific group of people. So you had a specific group of people who started to view the world in this new way. So let's take a look at how this journey unfolds in this literary way that is focused on this small group of protagonists. So in chapter 11, we have the generations of ancestors of and descendants of Abraham, so that Abraham took his family. We have a list of all of them, like Lot, like Sarai, and they left, then they went to get to Canaan, then they settled in Haran, and then one of them died in Haran. So the first stop of this family, the temporary stop, took place in Haran, on the path from Mesopotamia to Canaan, in where today Syria is located. So Abraham heard that he has to leave the home of his ancestors, go to the earth that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. I will elevate your name, and I will bless you. So I will bless those who bless you, and those who curse you, I will curse, and all the names of the earth will bless you. And Abram set forth like God told him to, and Lot went along with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he left Haran, and Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his nephew, and all their belongings, and all the souls that they've acquired in Haran, and they set forth to Canaan. And Abraham traveled across all the places until he went to Shechem in Marne. So here it's important that we have people who followed along with them, so people who joined the family of Abraham and Sarai. And here we have two interpretations. One, that these are people whom they've acquired, so they're servants or slaves. But we have a later midrash that says that these were the souls of their believers, so those whom they've convinced to follow Abraham and Sarai and their new concept of religion. And as Professor Rosenstein notes, it's very important that here we do not have the specific geographical borders. So this is important because then if ever you have geographical borders of the land of Canaan, the land that was given and promised to Abraham and Sarai, it has a political meaning, because the act of choosing and calling on Abraham and giving him the land, even though it's not been proven historically, many contemporary Jews view that as their right to settle in the land of Israel, to live there. or in the land of Canaan. So God showed himself to Abraham and he said, I will give you this land to your descendants. And then we have the quote from the Bible about Bethel and about the place where he created an altar to the Almighty, to the eternal God.
Mamy tu to wybranie Abrama.
So here we have the act of choosing Abram, later called Abraham. But we know that already at the early stage of the continuation of history, the history of this group, we know that this figure and the history of him being chosen, it has been constituted as a figure who started something, a founding figure, someone who is the reference point when we talk about the beginning of history of the Jewish people. And we find proof of that in the book of Joshua, in the farewell of Joshua to the people, so at the end of the book of Joshua. And as we know, this book begins right after the 5 books of Moses. So we have Joshua here who enters into the land of Canaan and who is conquering the land of Canaan. And at the end of this book, just like Moses, Joshua also gives his farewell speech. And he uses that speech to sum up all that had happened and to how his life and his leadership are part of the whole previous history of Jews or the Israelites. So in the 24th chapter of the book of Joshua, Joshua says, that's what the eternal God of Israel says, that on the other side of the river you had the fathers, and now he lists all the fathers, and they were worshipping foreign gods. And then I took your father Abraham from the other side of the river, and I led him to the land of Canaan, and I've multiplied his people. So now listen to the eternal and serve him honestly and in the truth, and move away the deities that your ancestors were serving on the other side of the river. So for the Israelites who entered, according to the book of Joshua, who entered into the land of Israel, and they did that after their time spent in slavery in Egypt. So this act is the fulfilling of the promise of giving the land to those people who identify themselves with the legacy of Abram or Abraham. So here we have a connection between forsaking by Abram or Abraham the polytheistic pagan religions and worshipping the one single God. So here we have a logical connection. So this land will be given just if you do away with the faith in different deities that different people who live in the Middle East worship, also those in the land of Canaan. So I spoke for a long time, so if there are any questions, then this is a good time to ask them.
Questions and comments can come from panelists as well as from people who are wanting to write in chat or raise their hand. Rabbi Klimova, please unmute.
Let me just add something fascinating, most fascinating that I found in Rabbi Marc's book, something that I'd never thought about when he describes the history of Abraham. He states that never does it mention, the book mentioned that he chose to be monotheist. always when we learn the history of the Jewish people, we are taught that we need to separate out various phases of history and literature, because people tend to put everything into one cauldron, everything. We need to look at the original source, being the Torah, and Rabbi Marc has directs our attention in a beautiful way. So he uses the word people ascribe to Abraham that he was atheist, but this is never, he never speaks, or Abraham, we never hear Abraham saying that. He rather says he has chosen a specific God, one God. Another interesting thing that was interesting for me in this chapter is this. We know many people in the context of conversion, and we read there that it's not that God chooses Abraham, but rather he chooses God. And that is very important. There is the vision of Abraham looking at the stars of the heavens and says, on that basis, I choose you, thee. So that's a fascinating moment. Miriam, thank you very much for this voice of yours. If there are no further comments, this was exactly what I wanted to touch upon, that we are actually looking at the choosing, or the choosing of Abraham himself. In the book of Joshua, we have a statement to the effect of them being required to cut off the peoples that are serving other gods, the false gods. But as far as Abraham is concerned, there isn't a clear statement of mutual there is a mutual exclusivity story rather than nothing else. It's obvious for us, of course, because we have in our minds and memories a text which, if you would ask any Jew who has learned about Abraham's story, he would say this is in the Torah. Bereshit Rabbah, of course, describes this. Where he's read about Abraham working in the store of his father Terach, and that's a story from a midrash, and this is ascribed into it. So these idols, he left the scope, and a woman with a bowl of meal to buy the idols, and Abraham took out a strong tool and broke all the idols. And when his father asked who did that, and he describes this further, that it was actually this woman who came to buy, and the idols started fighting between one another, and one took the tool and broke all the others. So this is Bereshit Rabbah, chapter 38. So actually, if we read the Bereshit chapter 13, and if you as a Jew think that this story is also part of the source, You assume that all the other idols have been rejected by Abram, but the original source text, it does not actually state that. It suggests it. We can imagine a situation in which Abram follows this God and others follow, which is not exactly the situation in which they would be free of other beliefs and other pulls on their thinking and lives. And we will see that in his family actually later, when we read about various idols that women hide in their tents. So this narrow monotheism that we assume about Abram is not exactly the same as we read from other further later texts. Then we read the book, the Jubilee book, 200 years before the current era, where we understand that the proto-rabbinic Judaism, how it perceives the chosenness or choosing of Abraham, where Rosh Hashanah book he studies throughout the night and waiting for rain to come the next day, and the word comes to him. All the signs are in the hand of the Most High, and he prays, "You have created everything, and I have chosen you." When I read that book, Jubilee book, it demonstrates to me the various incidents in our religion. First, it demonstrates to me how retroactive this source is, because it refers to the early parts of that description. Observation of stars, for example, are not directly linked with cults of various gods, linked with the Mesopotamian religions. Secondly, this text of Jubilee book, which seeks to convince us that the important holidays that are of importance now were already very important back then. So Rosh Hashanah is important here because it's the beginning of the religious new year. So the author of Jubilee book is trying to tell us that this is very important for us in 200 BCE, because according to the authors of that book, Abram was the one who discovered the Almighty, the Eternal One, at the Rosh Hashanah, beginning of the year. So what is beginning of a new year for us, of the great 10 days of judgment, is also the beginning of the time of reflection, because this was an important time of reflection for Abram also. Because this is what happened at that time. As Miriam said, God eternal, you are my God, you have created everything and I've chosen you. From perspective of someone who teaches has taught in 2 countries, in the US and in Poland, where I prepare lead conversion courses, I note that the books of the Jubilee book, the words, remind me or sound very much like the words we have before and right after Shema. in evening, Mariv Aravim in the evening, and Yotzer Or. You have created everything. In the evening, you've created beginning of the day and the night, and light, and fall in the morning, and Ahavat Olam. So here we have a blessing that speaks of the great love of the Eternal who has loved us. Then we have Shema, followed by Ve'ahavta, both in the evening and in the morning. In other words, it's up to you to love the Eternal One. So words of Siddur describes the relationship described in the Book of Jubilee. So the Eternal One creates the world and then chooses Abram and his spiritual and biological descendants, and our liturgy revolves around Shema, and it is in a sense a reflection of that dialogue between the Eternal One and Abram. This concept of Abram choosing God, which we have in the Book of Jubilee. Incredibly interesting to note that our liturgy helps us rerun, so to speak, that moment of Abrahamic discovery of God as described in the Jubilee book. And it works both ways, of course. Every time we recite these words, we, in a sense, place ourselves in that reflection of the Jubilee, book of Jubilee, which tells us what actually happened at the Lech Lecha moment. We don't have exact saying of what that means. What it means, go for yourself. We can imagine, of course, that Abraham is sitting somewhere on the roof of a house or in some tower or on the walls of the city where he's living, and comes down a ladder or steps and goes to Sarai and tells her, I've had this thought, reflection. Or maybe she tells him back, that makes sense. Maybe let's tell that to our friends and our servants. So that adds a context to the Lech Lecha moment. Now, when we have that statement first and description of how that ethnic group, tribal ethnic group, we could say, how it how they perceive themselves as servants of the God, newly discovered God, who assesses people, judges people according to their deeds. That group also has a unique sense of chosenness by the Eternal One, of entering into a covenant with Him, referred to in Hebrew as Brit, a covenant that on one hand is based on treaties that are known in the East, Middle East, these contracts between the political bodies. It's also a covenant with the descendants of Abraham. It has a moral dimension because it has specific requirements of ethical nature. And this covenant has that element, important element. And there is a mutuality to the relationship. It's not only that God requires something of Abraham and his descendants, but something that they require something of him. A most emblematic of those chapters is the history which describes the history of Abraham, that when he negotiates the future of Sodom and Gomorrah, requiring that it not be destroyed if appropriate minimal number of the righteous can be found there. In other words, justice being, righteousness being God's, something that is important value to both sides. Then we ask whether this is a history that, or tale that is historically verifiable. We cannot, of course, do that. Nonetheless, in the earlier let's say, layers of Jewish historical text, Joshua, book of Joshua, for example, it describes the entry into the land of Israel, and also the sign of the covenant is the sign of circumcision is at least 50% of our descendants continue being obliged to follow that. And most of Judaic strands of Judaism sees that as one of the indispensable elements of Jewish identity. So that, and also, we also have the Abrahamic inheritance or legacy in a sense that we are ready to stand on the minority side of history and follow on our individual path, the Ha'ivri, but also to negotiate with the Eternal One, a readiness to do that. As we've heard about as we hear or read about in the story of Sodom, also Abraham chooses to follow the Eternal One, and nearly in an unconditional way, ready to sacrifice his most precious. And we read in history, throughout history, about the sacrifice that Jews are ready to incur to remain on the path, so to speak. But of course, binding of Isaac is the story, the original story, chapter 22 of Bereshit, which proves how much Abraham is ready to sacrifice. And Jews in further ages were able to identify themselves or find them, understand that story of Isaac, and understand that following the Eternal One is linked with many sacrifices, including that of martyrdom. Let me close with words from Thomas Mann, famous German novelist, who in his famous Joseph and His Brothers writes the following words about Abraham, which I agree with fully. In some sense, Abraham was the father of God, and his thinking made God come alive. Abraham was not the creator, but wasn't there in him, since he recognized them, he brought this to reality with his thinking. So irrespective of Abraham was a single or a emblem of many people, and Sarai, of course, they were people, men and women, who through their thinking and actions, and which follows follows their path of finding their place in on earth, have become the people. And of course, the same through the Abrahamic religions have also plotted the path for Muslims and Christians. How do you read these two persons, Abraham and Sarah? Is it important for you whether they were historical personages or otherwise? Or do they exemplify certain paradigm of thinking, a change that had occurred in Near East? Let us open this question to those who do not necessarily have the title of a rabbi or a professor. Not everyone at the same time, please. I personally do not have the title of a professor in Poland as yet, was added. I am not sure whether participants can ask a question directly, but I think to myself, I'm very much for critical readings, and it's not that every iota in the Torah had been was placed on the Sinai. But when I think about Abraham, Sarah, Moses, in spite of not a shred of evidence being available to us that they were real living people, I look at this nonetheless in a pre-modern way. I don't separate this out. Somehow and synthesize it, and it's not, does not represent a major intellectual problem for me. Frankly, I have a very similar approach, by the way. On one hand, I have this deep sense that they may not be historical personages, as a progressive rabbi. Also, the stories about them are as close to me as stories about my beloved grandfather. And I don't have too many of those stories because, unfortunately, Holocaust has limited my access to my grandparents and other ancestors, because I happen to be born in Central Eastern Europe. Most of them murdered during the Shoah. Nonetheless, these stories are of great value and precious to me, even though I would never meet them personally. But I feel in similar way about Abraham. It's, even if they are not historical persons like my grandparents, nonetheless, they are all very close to me emotionally. So I was thinking how to best express that relationship, and the best explanation I came up with to explain that relationship is the relationship or experience one writer who wrote a book, Everything is Illuminated, a great novel and a great film with Elijah Wood in as the main character. Jonathan, at one point, worked on his own Haggadah about this basic constitutive Jewish text, that we'll utilize regularly, and we will utilize very soon during the year. And he asked himself whether Moses was actual historical person, real person. So Jonathan answered, I don't know. This was a question that his son asked, and his response was, I don't know, but we are linked with him. He is our ancestor. That is a perfect way that described my approach, connection of faith, emotional relationship to biblical text with science. In other words, I have no assurance. I personally am not a person that can my rights, political rights, I'm not sure of those geopolitical rights to the land of Israel. Yet, I can say that Abraham received the rights to that earth, and hence descendants have rights to that land. I don't know whether I could claim this in real political sense. Yet, what is true is that Abraham is emotionally very close, someone very close to me, which is a truth to me. And this is so that many generations adopted that and created civilization based on a loving assumption that this is indeed so. Other questions and reflections in the comments? Or a direct, if you can speak up using the system, please submit them.
I wanted to say something. First of all, I'm not a professor either. So just want to set that record straight. But more importantly, I wanted to comment that in the past couple of years after I wrote the book, I was thinking more about Abraham's experience and what really happened at that moment when God said to him, get out, according to the Bible text. And it occurs to me that often in human affairs, we find ourselves in a situation living in a society or in a community which we find morally intolerable. And we can't imagine how we can continue to live in that place since we don't seem to be able to change it. And one option, which has always been available in our Jewish tradition, is to get up and leave. And a question which has occupied me a lot in the past couple of years is, how do you know when it's time to get up and leave? Is it God that tells you, or is it your conscience that tells you, or is looking out the window too painful? And all you can do is get up and leave. And maybe that's what happened to Abraham. That he looked around at the moral condition of the society in which he lived, and he said, I can't do this anymore. And he got up and left. And for him, that was God's voice speaking through his own conscience. So I think that Abraham's experience can be very relevant and instructive to the dilemmas that people face in every time and place, including the current moment.
This is incredibly important for us. When is the time to leave a place and to establish something new elsewhere? The other side of the coin here is the question that if we leave one place, where do we go from there? And another additional question comes up. If we leave, then what would have been the price would be of staying on? So this is important that we're mentioning this. There are places that are still worth fighting for, and we have and our people, Jewish people, fight for a place, but then there are situations of places in which, for example, Lot lives, and even though he gets support from Abraham, the place is unsustainable. They need to leave. Also, in the next installment of our lecture, we will learn about a place that is unique, that if one place is given to Israel doesn't mean that they will stay there forever. Some places they leave and then they have to reclaim it, go back to it. So in the history of Abrahamic descendants, we have cyclical comings and goings, and Canaan is a place where Abraham and his next generations live in, sojourn, and then leave, and then come back to again. And there are many such moments of that history. Canaan remains a place of safety, but then it becomes an unsafe place which they need to defend or leave. So that's something that speaks to us post 7th of October, Israel being a proverbial place where it's finally safe to be as a Jew, for Jews. And suddenly we learn and see that this event has broken this way of simplistic way of thinking about Israel in the world. So this cyclicality of Jewish fate, that is an important point, and the sense that possibly being part of Jewish peoplehood, it's always being going upstream and against the grain or on the other side of the street that no one goes into. Are there any other comments?
Let me see. Okay. Myślę, że jeżeli nie ma innych komentarzy.
If there are no further comments, then let me hand over
ostatnie słowo rabinowi
to Rabbi Chaim
Markowi Rosensteinowi, żeby
and Marc Rosenstein
nadali nam kierunek na
to give us a direction for further meetings and lectures. Each of you will, each of these units will be specific. This is, of course, the introductory unit, and readers have not yet been able to understand the book in depth, which they will be required to do. And hopefully your reflections will help us set the direction for our further struggles with the Jewish history.
Marc, any last words or blessings for this Lech Lecha journey through Jewish history?
Marc, I think that's
Rabbi Chaim, I think that's your cue.
Okay, I thought it was directed to you. First of all, it is directed to both of us. I want to thank Rabbi Kirschenbaum. What a wonderful way of bringing us into some of the most important questions of origins, of directions, of covenant, of the struggles and the challenges that we face as heirs of this wonderful tradition. We look forward to a number of further sessions. They will be meeting at the same time. This is the only time we're going to have a webinar format. In the future, everything will be in Polish, and the rabbis who participated today, Rabbi Kirschenbaum, Rabbi Klimova, and Menachem Mirsky, who unfortunately had the responsibilities of being taken away because of congregational obligations, will be leading the class. And we know that there are a number of people who are listening to the first lecture in Polish, and we are sure that you are in the good hands of these three wonderful Polish rabbis. I want to mention the role of Jan and Arek as professors and intellectuals reading the book. The book will be in a Amazon format, and you will receive the opportunity to buy it. The first couple of sessions, until we get that organized, we'll be sending the chapters to people who are participating. Let me just conclude with thanking Matti again and asking Marc to say a word also of conclusion. Those of you who are interested in this class in English, Menachem Mirsky said, well, I've enjoyed preparing this class so much that I'm going to offer it in English. So we will try to get those of you who are English speakers connected to Rabbi Mirsky and his offering the class. I think he's willing to offer it on Zoom. Our task is in Polish, and we wish all of you well. I want to acknowledge the work of Dominika, who's done the engineering and the coordinating, and will be the person that will be the go-to person to try to answer many of the questions. So we need to support her and making sure that we have organized things so that she can respond quickly and efficiently. My thanks to Marjana, my thanks to Marek. Marek, would you like to add a word?
Just that this was a great pleasure for me. I really enjoyed Rabbi Matti's take on my book. I don't think I've ever heard anyone lecture the book except me. So so it was refreshing to hear a different voice. And I'm sorry I don't know Polish, but I wish you all well. And if there are any problems or questions that people want to direct to me, I'd be happy to respond at any point during the course.
Thank you all.